All right, guys. So now that we've had a little bit of an overview with federalism and some ideas of um, the federal system and eras of federalism, you've also had a brief introduction now to what fiscal federalism is and regulated federalism. So we're going to dive into those ideas in a little bit more detail here. So this idea of cooperative federalism is that you have levels of government that work together and cooperate in the same areas. But what happens when states don't want to cooperate with what the federal government wants to do? What happens when states flat out refuse or just won't play ball? Well, this is where the concept of coercive federalism comes into play. And the idea here is that you have a strong central government that is then able to exert control over the states through other methods. And a lot of times what we see is that in order to do this, those methods include money or orders, mandates, or regulations that force the state's hand and force them into compliance with things that the federal government wants. And oftentimes, mandates, orders, or regulations include strings, so to speak, that force states to follow policy or face consequences, or perhaps even reward states for following a policy. And oftentimes, that string is going to be money. So in order to get the states to do what they want, they attach the funding that states so desperately need to their rules and regulations so that they'll follow through. And oftentimes this is how we'll see that the federal government is going to try to maybe overstep and insert themselves into policy areas that would traditionally be considered reserved powers or areas that states are responsible for. An example of this would be the Drinking Age Act of 1984, where the states were responsible for establishing a drinking age, and states had things for anywhere from 18 to 24 at the time. But the federal government was really concerned about the number of drunk driving deaths that they were seeing. And actually, thanks to an interest group, MAD, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, they pressured Congress to pass a law that established the drinking age at 21. Now, this was not a federal power to regulate. Again, this belonged to the states, but the federal government essentially passed this law, and in order to enforce states into compliance, made railroad and interstate and highway funds, transportation funds, contingent on states' compliance with certain policies. And it was a significant enough amount of money where if states didn't comply, they would be losing out on funding. So we saw every state raising their drinking age to 21. Regulated federalism is something that is heavily used from the 60s to 80s, but still a little bit today, but in combination with that concept of new federalism that the crash course video talked about. And essentially, it requires government mandates, regulations, or commands that states have to abide by, and again, dependent mostly on money, and more specifically through the form of mandates. So a mandate is something, an order that states must follow, and again, they have to comply with. And mandates can take three forms: funded mandates, meaning the government, federal government, is completely paying for them; unfunded mandates, where they just say, hey, states, you got to do this, and the states have to come up with all of the money on their own; and perhaps underfunded mandates, where the federal government will give some money, but it's not nearly enough to be able to give the states the flexibility to cover that cost on their own. And a lot of times it requires a lot of budget rewriting to be able to afford that. Now, some of the problems with these things, right, are that any branch can issue mandates. And it could come through a law, it could come through an executive order or a bureaucratic regulation. It could be something that ends up forcing compliance due to a Supreme Court decision. But regardless of that, we've seen that, especially starting in the 1960s, there was a drastic increase in the number of mandates that states were expected to follow. For instance, maybe specific education requirements, healthcare or welfare programs, and different things like that. And oftentimes it forces the states to undertake policies that they wouldn't have chosen to under their own circumstances. And it also is frustrating for the states because it limits their choices. So an underfunded mandate, again, is a program that the states have to carry out, but the federal government can't cover the full cost. An example of that is Medicare, Medicaid, where people can participate and there's it's what we call an entitlement program. So anybody who meets a certain criteria can, and the states have to fund it. And so if that number goes up, the states have to cover that. The amount of funding that they're getting from the federal government isn't necessarily changing to keep up with that. Unfunded mandates, where a state has to carry out a program and the federal government doesn't cover any of it, is of course the most controversial thing, and they draw very sharp criticism from the states. And a good example of this would be the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, where the federal government mandated that all public buildings had to be made wheelchair accessible, but all at the cost of state and local governments. Same thing with Asbestos Hazard Removal Act, where states and local governments were ordered to remove asbestos from all public buildings, but there was no federal funds to do that. Also frustrating to the states are that Congress can pass these laws, pass these mandates, as can the federal government, and they don't have to provide a cost estimate. This political cartoon right here is showing some commentary on a No Child Left Behind mandate. No Child Left Behind was an education bill passed under the administration of George W. Bush that put certain regulations and requirements in place for schools to meet a certain performance standards and face consequences if they didn't. So if you look at this political cartoon, you can pause here for a second and think about what the message is, answer it in your notes. You'll also be answering this in those reflection and application questions assigned on Canvas. Fiscal federalism is a very key part of cooperative federalism, and it's how the federal government tries to influence the states through what we call the power of the purse. And the power of the purse is a term to refer to the fact that Congress makes the budget and they hold the funds, and it's ultimately Congress that is going to tax and spend and decide how and where that money is going to be spent. So giving or withholding funds can become a part of policy, or again, kind of that punishment if a state refuses to enact a policy that the federal government wants. So fiscal federalism is a pattern of spending, taxing, and providing grants in the federal system. And it's a huge component of the federal government and how that relationship with the state and local governments carry out. So again, if we think about that regulated federalism, what happens if states refuse to comply with regulations? Well, money is how we get states to cooperate in the era of cooperative federalism. And this is one way, again, that the federal government has been able to expand their influence into areas of reserved powers and things that would traditionally be the responsibility of the states. So money here is the carrot and also the stick. So it's the way that we get states to play ball, because we make money, we make funding dependent on compliance with federal policies. So this is the number one way that government can influence state and local governments to do what they want, and essentially offers federal dollars for a price. So grants and aid, that highlighted term there, that would be a payment from one level of government to another for a specified purpose. So the federal government would say, if you enact this policy, we will give you this money. States can always reject it. There's no requirement to take it, but a grant and aid is essentially free money. So it's money that they would have had to come up with in their budget otherwise. And so while states can, yes, turn down funds, it's a hard call to make because you are oftentimes giving up a lot of money, and the states depend on money coming from the federal government, and the federal government knows that. Now, grants, this is again free money, right? So states are getting money, and there's a couple different types of grants. And what we see today is that The more popular type of grant is the categorical grant. And the categorical grant is a grant that comes with strings attached. So the federal government says, hey, we can give you this amount of money, but there are some stipulations here. That money has to be used for a specific purpose. Oftentimes there are crossover sanctions, which means that the federal government would withhold funds unless states change policy in one area to conform for to federal goals. For example, federal money for highway and construction maintenance in exchange for a 0.08 DUI drinking limit. So there's money for this purpose, it's a specific purpose, but you also have to do this. There's another thing called cross-cutting requirements, and this is when a condition on one federal grant has to be extended to all activities covered or supported by federal funds. So for instance, we're going to give universities money, but they have to stop discriminatory practices in any programs on their campus that are supported by federal money. Of categorical grants, there are two types here. Project grants are the most common, and they're awarded by competitive application or merit, and again, for a very specific purpose. So it could be a university research grant for breast cancer research, or right now, COVID times, we're giving you money for two companies who are going to have the most promise in making a successful vaccine. Formula grants are a grant that are given in accordance to a formula for a given number of recipients. So if you have, for instance, X amount of people on Medicaid or X amount of people on food stamps in your state, you'll get X amount of the money available. And that would vary by need depending on where you live and in a given state. Now, states don't like categorical grants because it's more restrictive, but federal government purposes, they love it because they can have more control and more of a say in how that money is being used, which as much oversight as they can have and as much direction as they can give, they're going to like that better. So it's no surprise then that states will prefer the alternative to the categorical grant, which is a block grant. And a block grant is much less restrictive. You specify a general policy area, and states can decide how to use the funds from there. So a block grant is money that will support broad programs, and states have more discretion on how they want to spend that money. But there's the accountability issue here, which is we don't have as much oversight to dictate how that money is used. Are they really using it for this broad purpose, or are they funneling that fund somewhere else? So fewer strings attached, more power to the states, which again, they like. The block grant is a key feature of something called devolution, which became very popular under Reagan, even Nixon a little bit, late 70s, early 80s. But this return of power to the state, kind of take away that government oversight, that federal government control, and give back some of that flexibility to the states. One thing that I like to kind of compare for a categorical grant versus a block grant is if your parents are going to give you allowance money. So you get allowance money, and under the categorical grant, kind of going back to this idea, it would be, hey, I have this much money for you, and you are going to go spend it on jeans. So you specifically have to use this money that I just gave you to buy a pair of jeans. The crossover sanction would be, but hey, I'm not going to give you this money to buy jeans until you also clean your room or do these other things. Where a block grant would be, hey, I'm going to give you this money and go buy some clothes. And you're able to decide where you want to spend that money, what type of clothing you need. But hey, there's not a lot of oversight. Your parents aren't going to check up on you. Maybe you're going to use that money to go see a movie instead. There's not as much of accountability as how that money will be used. This graph here is just showing how federal grants to state and local governments has increased recently, as much as 650 million, and that number is growing every year, of money that goes to the states, and it's free money, either for a broad or specific purpose. A lot of it, though, is going to support increasing health costs. And you can see we had a very sharp decline in 2010, 2011 as a result of a stimulus package. Now, what are some of the problems then with regulated and fiscal federalism? One concern is that it creates what we call competitive federalism, where there's so much competition to get this money. And federalism also almost treats state and local governments like firms in a competitive marketplace where they have to compete against one another across a number of areas to get that money. And so there's competition for residents, for businesses, for revenue, and everybody wants businesses that will create the tax revenue and the jobs and get them more money from the government. And there's some concern sometimes that this actually forces what we call a race to the bottom, where there's such an aggressive competition for this money that states actually lower their standards to qualify for more money. We also have the problem of preemption, that national policy always supersedes a state or local policy, where state and local governments have to obey the federal law and enforce the program, even if they have their own law that works better. And so we also can see then that the frustration ensues that laws aren't one size fits all, and that the needs, right, we have a very diverse population of people in this country, that the law that Congress passes may not really fit a certain region of the country. But unfortunately, the states have to abide by that. States can have laws that go above and beyond the federal law, but the federal law is the bare minimum. Now, today, we see that there's been this movement towards cooperative federalism. So work together, cooperate, joint efforts in similar policy areas, but also adding an element of greater state autonomy, so more independence for the states. And this is called new federalism, popularized again late 70s, 80s, starting with Nixon and still popular today. A key aspect of that is revenue sharing, which is the sharing of tax revenue to fund programs. So tax revenue generated at the state and federal level used to fund different programs. They also supply less restricted federal grants and give the states more discretion. And a key element of that, especially in the 80s and Nixon, were that we used block grants. So grants that again gave the states more flexibility and more of a say in how they wanted to use that money. Now, since Reagan, and especially under more conservative administrations, we see this process of something called devolution. So devolution is a continuation of new federalism, but the big concerted effort here is to restrict federal power, peel back some of the oversight and restrictions that the federal government had placed on the states, and return more and more power and discretion to the states. So a loosening of federal regulations and a continued effort to make the states, again, more prime in the areas that, constitutionally speaking, should be theirs to regulate. So in the 90s, when this all kind of started post-Reagan, we saw a flurry of federal laws repealed. And again, it kind of depends on who's in office. More conservative administrations tend to support devolution. When you have more liberal administrations, you see kind of a return to that tightening and that restriction. Once you are finished with the application and reflection question activity on Canvas, your next step will be to read our second required SCOTUS case, which is United States versus Lopez. This fits within this idea of devolution, and your question to consider as you read that case is, does Congress have the authority to outlaw guns near schools under the Commerce Clause?